John Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, while bombs from World War II were falling over the city. The sound of sirens and the glow of explosions became the background of his earliest memories. His mother, Julia, was a free-spirited woman who loved music, while his father, Alfred, was a sailor who was rarely home. The instability of his family shaped the restless spirit that would define him for life. At the age of 5, John was forced to choose between his parents. A heartbreaking moment that left a scar he carried forever. Eventually, he was raised by his strict yet caring aunt, Mimi Smith, at 251 Menlove Avenue. In that house, filled with rules and silence, Lennon found his escape through sound. He discovered rock and roll through Elvis Presley and Lonnie Donegan, strumming a cheap guitar and dreaming of something bigger than the grey streets of Liverpool. School offered him little joy. Teachers saw him as rebellious and sarcastic, too clever to be controlled. But his wit, humor, and creativity began to form a personality larger than life. Music became his refuge, and in his teenage years, he formed a skiffle band called the Quarrymen. Then, one summer day in 1957, fate introduced him to a young musician named Paul McCartney, a meeting that would change music history forever. The Quarrymen soon evolved into the Beatles, joined by George Harrison and later Ringo Starr. Within a few years, they conquered the world. Lennon and McCartney became one of the greatest songwriting duos of all time, writing songs that captured the hopes, dreams, and heartbreaks of a generation. Yet, beneath the fame, Lennon was battling his own emptiness, a mix of trauma, anger, and the constant search for meaning. 1962, while the Beatles were still finding their footing in the world of professional music, John Lennon quietly married his college sweetheart, Cynthia Powell, in a modest ceremony at the Mount Pleasant Register Office in Liverpool. There were no reporters, no public celebration, and almost no one outside their closest circle knew. At the time, the Beatles' new manager, Brian Epstein, was carefully crafting the band's image. He wanted them to appear clean, charming, and most importantly available to their rapidly growing female fan base. Epstein understood the power of fantasy in pop music marketing. Young fans didn't just listen to the Beatles. They dreamed about them, and to preserve that dream, he believed that none of the members should be publicly tied down by marriage. John's wedding came at a time when the Beatles were just beginning to attract attention from record companies. Epstein feared that news of a married Beatle might ruin their appeal, especially to teenage girls who fueled record sales and concert hysteria. As a result, he insisted that Lennon keep his marriage secret, at least until the band had fully secured its place in the public eye. Lennon reluctantly agreed. He adored Cynthia, but he also knew that defying Epstein could jeopardize everything the Beatles were working toward. Thus, for the sake of the band's image, John Lennon, who prided himself on honesty and rebellion, was forced to live a lie. Cynthia, meanwhile, was thrust into an uncomfortable position. She loved John deeply, but their marriage had to remain invisible. When the Beatles began touring across Britain, and later the world, she often had to hide her presence or pretend to be merely a friend. In interviews, Lennon avoided any mention of being married, and fans continued to see him as the charming, single frontman of the world's most exciting new band. In truth, while millions of girls were screaming his name, Lennon was returning to a quiet apartment each night, where his young wife waited, far removed from the chaos of Beatlemania. In his later years, Lennon openly reflected on that time, with a mixture of irony and regret. In the Beatles anthology, he said, "Brian thought it would be bad for my image if the fans knew I was married, so I was told to keep quiet about it." He admitted that the secrecy created a rift in his personal life, as he struggled to balance fame, guilt, and love. Cynthia, too, later revealed that she often felt like a shadow in her own husband's life, watching him become a global superstar while being told to remain unseen. The irony was painful. John Lennon, who would later become a symbol of truth, peace, and personal freedom, began his career under the weight of a carefully constructed illusion. His marriage to Cynthia, meant to be an intimate and joyful union, instead became an early casualty of the machinery of fame. By the time the truth about their relationship became public, the image of John the Beatle had already solidified into something far larger than the man himself. When asked years later about that era, Lennon remarked bitterly, that he was never allowed to show who I really was not as a Beatle, not as a husband. The pressure of maintaining that perfect image, combined with the strain of constant touring and media attention, contributed to the eventual collapse of their marriage. By 1968, John had met Yoko Ono, and his relationship with Cynthia came to an end. Yet looking back, many biographers agree that the secrecy surrounding his first marriage reveals the darker side of the Beatles' rise to fame, the human cost of turning 4 young men into untouchable idols. Ultimately, the story of John Lennon and Cynthia Powell's hidden marriage stands as a reminder of how the entertainment industry often sacrifices authenticity for marketability. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly for the Beatles in commercial terms, but it came at a deep personal cost to the people behind the myth. Lennon, in particular, would spend much of his later life rebelling against the very illusion that had made him famous, seeking truth and openness wherever he could. But in 1962, he was just a young man in love, forced to keep that love a secret, all for the sake of the dream called the Beatles. By 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, Lennon began to feel trapped by the image of the lovable mop top. He wanted more than just pop stardom. That same year, he met Yoko Ono, an avant-garde artist whose boldness and vision struck something deep within him. She wasn't afraid to challenge or provoke, and with her, Lennon found both a muse and a mirror. As the Beatles drifted apart in the late 1960s, Lennon's music grew increasingly personal and raw. Songs like Julia and Across the Universe revealed his longing for peace and authenticity. When the band finally broke up in 1970, it marked not only the end of an era, but also the beginning of Lennon's journey as an individual, one unfiltered, political, and deeply human. His solo career began with a roar. Songs like Working Class Hero, Give Peace a Chance and Power to the People turned him into a voice of activism. Lennon and Yoko became icons of the anti-war movement, staging their famous Bed In for Peace events, where they invited journalists to witness their protest from a hotel bed. But behind the humor and idealism, their actions alarmed the US government. President Richard Nixon's administration saw Lennon as a potential threat, a man with massive influence over the youth who could rally millions against the Vietnam War. The FBI began a campaign of surveillance and intimidation. They tapped his phone, followed his movements, and compiled thick files filled with reports, photographs, and informant notes. Lennon, unknowingly at first, had become a political target. By 1971, John and Yoko had moved permanently to New York City, settling into the vibrant counterculture scene. But soon, the dream of freedom turned into a quiet war. The US government tried to deport Lennon repeatedly, claiming visa violations. In reality, it was an attempt to silence him. Under constant watch, Lennon became more cautious, living what many fans would later call his undercover years. Those years at the Dakota building in Manhattan were a paradox both peaceful and haunted. Lennon and Yoko retreated from public life, surrounding themselves only with trusted friends. John learned to live quietly, spending his days cooking, reading, and caring for their son Sean, born in 1975. He called this period his house husband years. For a man who once stood in front of stadiums filled with screaming fans, the silence was almost sacred. He stopped recording music for 5 years. Instead of fighting systems or preaching peace to the world, Lennon turned inward. He discovered that real peace might not come from changing others, but from accepting oneself. By the end of the 1970s, Lennon felt ready to return. He began writing again, this time with a gentler tone. Songs like Watching the Wheels and Just Like Starting Over reflected a wiser, calmer man who had finally made peace with his past. For the first time in decades, Lennon seemed genuinely happy not as a Beatle, not as a revolutionary, but simply as John. Tragically, that peace would not last. On the night of December 8, 1980, as he returned home to the Dakota, John Lennon was shot and killed by a deranged fan. The world stood still. Crowds filled the streets of New York, singing Imagine Through Their Tears. The man who had spent his life preaching love, peace, and truth had been silenced by violence. But his voice never disappeared. John Lennon remains more than a musician. He is an idea, a symbol of rebellion mixed with tenderness, proof that one person's dream can echo for generations. From the angry boy in Liverpool to the man who tried to live quietly under the weight of fame and surveillance, Lennon's story is one of contradiction and courage. He showed that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the act of choosing love, even when the world feels broken. And though he once lived undercover, far from the noise and flash of fame, his message continues to surface everywhere. That imagination, pure, fearless imagination, can still change the world.